Welcome to the Rachael podcast. As always, I'm your host, Farouk Bello. And today's episode, we have Rachael Moses on the podcast, who is the president-elect of the British Thoracic Society. She's also a respiratory consultant physiotherapist here in the UK. And in this podcast episode, we are talking about smoking. We're talking about the social and cultural detriments to your health and cultural beliefs all around lung health particularly. And as you can tell from the title, How to Destroy Your Lungs, this is a two-part series, which is first how to destroy your lungs, and second part is how to save your lungs. We talk about a lot of things in this first part, namely just a few of the things we talk about are, COVID, long-term effects of COVID, which you probably might have heard as long COVID, and how people can experience symptoms, 6 months, 9 months down the line. And she goes a lot more into detail about that, which I found very interesting to myself. We talk about the public message on COVID and the protocols, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it all around. And we just talk about generally, the day-to-day things that we do that may be good, bad for your health. Probably the first part of this will be a lot more of the negative things, and then we'll show you more of the, for lack of a better word, the lights or the things that we can do to help ourselves in the second part. So, Rachel is an amazing person, and I'm very grateful she came on the podcast. But without further ado, I give you Rachael Moses. Welcome back to the Rachael podcast. And today's episode, as I always say, and if you've listened to the podcast, I always say it's a special episode because to me, all the episodes are special with the people I talk to. And today's episode is with none other than Rachael Moses, who is the AHP leader, one of the forefront people in respiratory physiotherapy and respiratory in general. So I'll let Rachael introduce herself so she can give her proper titles and proper introduction with her own words.
Oh, thanks, Farouk. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a massive fan of yours. Honestly, I am, and always very nervous being on the receiving end of questions. But my name is Rachael Moses, and I am Associate Director of Rehabilitation and Therapies at the Roy Brompton and Harefield Trust here in London. I also am newly elected BTS President-elect, so that's British Thoracic Society, which is a kind of internationally leading respiratory society, first non-medic, so I'm super proud of that.
Congratulations.
And I do a lot of other roles. Thank you. I do a few other roles, like I sit on CSP Council. I'm honorary student president, which I'm, again, really thankful for because that gives me great opportunity to just add diversity to my thought and practice. And I do humanitarian aid work, medical aid for Palestinians, and work as part of the Thorax BMJ editorial team. So I'm sure I've probably missed something out, but I spread my hours.
Very, very busy woman, as you can see. So I'm very happy that she was. I was able to get her on the podcast, and you can tell, if you couldn't tell, Rachael is a physiotherapist like myself, but one with way more experience and way more years under her belt than myself. So I have a lot to learn from this podcast episode, and I'm sure you too as well will take something from this podcast episode. So let's talk quickly about, before we get into the podcast topic of the day, which is how to destroy your lungs. And no, I'm not being sarcastic when I say how to destroy your lungs, but you'll get the gist of why I'm using that as the topic later on as we discuss. But let's quickly talk about the president of the PTS Society and what's that all about, the president-elect, and what that means and why is that relevant for you?
So the British Thoracic Society, as I mentioned, is a society that is responsible for bringing together clinicians, multi-professional, multidisciplinary clinicians across respiratory medicine into one place, into one society. And the BTS is most widely recognised for producing guidelines and quality statements and helping to really steer respiratory practice. And these guidelines are used all across the world, and they rely on us having like specialist advisory groups about working with key stakeholders like the British Lung Foundation and Asthma UK, and really bringing together experts in the field to produce consensus statements which uses evidence and research, or maybe provides advice where research evidence doesn't exist. And we also have, global priorities in terms of lung health, in terms of smoking cessation, in terms of developing countries, and how we can support our colleagues across the world. So yeah, it's a great organisation. What it means to me to be president-elect, so I'll move into presidency position next year, is that as the first non-medic, this is really just demonstrating to people that normal people can achieve these positions. Like, there's nothing special about me. I haven't got a doctorate. I haven't got a PhD or a professorship. I'm really impressed with people that do have those. But I am a clinician that's just worked really hard over the last 20 years. And I've kind of just put myself out there. I've got around a bit, Farouk, and I've put myself out there. So my advice is, if you want to get in similar positions in your career, you can totally do it. So that's why it's important to me.
Brilliant. I think that you answered that question very well, and so you can see what the BTS Society means to Rachel, and also, being the first non-med non-doctor is, it really does show people that, you don't have to be, but it's great. So now that we've talked about that, let's get into the meat of the episode. And we've already had a quick pre-podcast talk with Rachel about this, just explaining. But the question is, how do you destroy your lungs? And when I say that, I mean, what are the things that me and everyone else, or what are these issues that we do on a regular day-to-day basis, or real issues that have both short-term and long-term effects on our lungs and your respiration? Because everyone knows without lungs, you're not going anywhere. There are a few organs in your body that, when those are compromised, your quality of life significantly drop, or, well, you don't want them to be compromised. And it becomes a whole issue of management. It's the brain, the heart, and the lungs. So I think those are the three big ones. So what are the things that, we always do on a regular basis that we think are good, or that are actually quite bad for our health?
Oh, wow. So that's just such a small question, isn't it? If I kind of start from a different angle and say, if I was to tell you that 1 in 5 people suffer from respiratory disease, and it's the third biggest cause of death, or it has the highest mortality rate in the UK, that really shows us that respiratory disease is important, that people do die from it. And with 1 in 5 being affected, it can significantly impact the quality of life on a large percentage of the population. Now, there's huge healthcare inequalities that come with respiratory disease, and there's lots of inherited conditions. There is conditions that are beyond our control, so that they're unpreventable respiratory conditions, let's say. Yeah. But we have those, and I think that's going to be the majority of how I answer this question, is preventable respiratory conditions. We talk about the most obvious, and that is smoking.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And we kind of had a little chat about this offline, but smoking is multifactorial. And in the world of respiratory medicine, we never, I say never, I'm generalizing, but we don't judge people for smoking, because it can be something that is a lifestyle choice because of numerous reasons. So that could be cultural. In some cultures, it's very appropriate to smoke. In fact, it would be inappropriate not to smoke, because it's linked to certain cultural beliefs and behaviors. In some, it comes with occupation. So I mentioned I come from the shipyards, a place called Wallsend, and there was previously a mining village, and you had a cup of tea and you had a cigarette. Now you have a cup of tea and a rich tea, or a chocolate hobnob, or whatever it is. So we've moved away from smoking to an obesity epidemic. But so it's these inherent cultural behaviours and also societal behaviours. And when I think back to when I was a child, which I was at the time, growing up in Wallsend, which was a lower class social environment, I would say, generally. Children were almost encouraged to smoke. So you'd go to the corner shop with your 10 pence to get a 10 pence mix up. And they had a penny tray for the sweets, but they also had a cigarette tray. And for 10 pence, you could buy a single cigarette as a child, or you could buy 10 pence mix up. And that is and if there's any Geordies out there, maybe anyone else that comes from a similar community to mine, and I'm 42, by the way, so this is like, we're talking, not too far away.
Yeah, it's not long.
but that was allowed, and yes, it was against the law, but they still had them. They had the tab trays, we used to call them, and you could
Very
buy a
normal.
cigarette and you could smoke. Yeah, it was very normal, and it was reinforcing that smoking was okay. And then, of course, times have changed having the fruit. So we'll have advertising. So tobacco companies are banned from being involved in a lot of commercial activities, from advertising sporting events. On the packets of cigarettes, it's very clear that smoking kills, causes lung disease, heart disease, can cause stroke. So that's probably the biggest public health problem that we have, tobacco. Now, it is, I mentioned to you that I've been on a call today with the Tobacco Specialist Advisory Group, actually, for BTS, and the statistics are still shocking. So one of the statistics on one of the surveys shows that 40%, I think it was, of all 16 to 45-year-olds that admit into hospital smoke. Now, that's not a complete true representation of everyone, because, sorry, there's just an ambulance going past.
It's fine. We know Rachel works in she's a hospital, so it's part of. I'll take that as part of the podcast experience. You get to hear the sirens and day-to-day life of someone who's in the thick of it. Carry on, Rachel.
Thank you. So things have changed, but we are still very much living in a world where we are still kind of suffering the consequences of those societal, cultural, healthcare beliefs. Smoking is a preventable disease, though, and when we see young people coming into hospital, either because they have a respiratory condition or because they've got something else and they do smoke, that's a comorbidity for these people. And we talk about prevention, but we also talk about whose role is it to avoid these preventable diseases. Now, if I throw in another factor, which is obesity, how do we damage our lungs? How are we destroying our lungs, like you said? Yeah. Very few people relate obesity to respiratory disease. But one of the most shocking realizations I had in my previous role as a consultant respiratory physio in long-term ventilation is we had a 12-year-old child who was so obese that they needed referral for a breathing machine to help them sleep at night. So the pediatricians couldn't really work out why this child was so malaised, etc., other than being obese. And they did need a breather machine at night, a CPAP machine, some of you might have heard about. Yeah. So to me, and this is way beyond this podcast, but to me, when a child can't go and buy their own food, or they have no control about buying the Mars bars or whatever it is, then that again, it's who's this whole how we damaging our lungs. Obesity is a major part of that, and then we've got inactivity. So if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's about how much we rely on other technologies, on gyms to get fit and active. How many people piled the COVID pounds on? I did, because I didn't have an incentive to get out there and do normal activity because I wasn't motivated. So inactivity as well. So if I was to give you three, smoking, obesity, inactivity, and then there's the occupational stuff, so pollution. Occupational hazards are huge.
Yeah. So each of those three, we can go into each of those three actually, because those are. So for those listening, we're going to do this into two parts, as we said. We'll give you the hard truths now, but we'll also give you the bright side in a bit later. But with things like smoking and as you said, some of these things are cultural and they're societal. And for me, hearing that is very interesting because hearing that at a young age you could go and buy a cigarette and obviously back in the day, I can imagine years ago in my parents' generation, and back then, smoking was deemed as, it was a good thing. And this all, you can go down a rabbit hole and talking about marketing and how there's big money and all this type of thing, but that's how it was in the past, but we won't go into that. And for me, I find it very interesting how, till today, even in 2020, it's still, as you said, we don't judge people who smoke because, as you said, there are multiple reasons. And when you start looking into each of these reasons and trying to decode why, it really starts to bring out things that you realize sometimes it's out of some people's control. And this is not an excuse because sometimes it's within your control. It's the hard truths of it. And you've talked about, smoking and obesity. Obesity is another one that, for me, when you think of, respiratory issues, obesity is not the first thing that comes into your mind. For me, now I'm thinking about it. It's not on the immediate pecking order of when you're thinking. You normally think, smoking, and you're thinking pollution, but you don't think of obesity, because I don't know, for an extent, there are, in the culture we live in now in society, obesity has become almost a touchy subject when you bring it up sometimes. But as medical professionals, when you see the impacts of things like this on real human beings, as you said, I can imagine the child you saw was a very you have to empathize with to an extent, because you're thinking this is, as you said, it preventable to an extent. It's not something that you need to go through. I worked for To give someone quick background, I had a placement in a cystic fibrosis ward once. And I know cystic fibrosis is something that is not preventable. It's a genetic thing, and these people who they had no choice, but they had to go the rest of their lives. And people manage it differently. Some we did a lot better, some did a lot worse, but for that type of thing, it's not preventable. But when you're thinking about other things that are preventable, I think we need to put more emphasis on trying to minimize the amount of health issues that we have, that we can change, things that we have a role in playing, that we can actually have a bigger impact on before you get there. It comes back to all to preventative medicine. But pollution is another one which I find interesting. I mean, if you talk to people from older generations, pollution was almost a natural day to day. People who worked in the mines, people work. I think, what's the one that you can't have in buildings anymore? What's that lining on the walls? I forget the name. But it's as
Asbestos.
yes, asbestos. And these are things that, back then people thought, it's a normal thing, but it was slowly killing a lot of people. And in the modern day, are there still things, the pollutants that we know the air is not 100% pure, and the air in different parts of the world varies. But at the current moment now, what are the major things, if we're talking about pollution, that you're still seeing currently?
What do you mean specifically in relation to pollution?
Yeah, no, just think in respect to, like, pollution and well, yeah, kind of specifically to pollution.
So, in terms of there's climate change, which we know is affecting pollution. So that there's the climate change agenda, which is huge. We have occupational exposure to pollutants. And we actually know the links between, in some healthcare inequalities, between socioeconomic and deprivation status is linked to multiple demographics, which include exposure to occupational pollutants. So that's poor air pollution, and those people that live in inner city areas, compare inner city to rural, in the incidence of lung disease, and also other occupational pollutants. So that may be poor housing. And when you live when you have poor housing conditions, you generally, so that could be damp, that could be some of the asbestos type that you spoke about. You're generally probably going to have worse nutrition, and you're probably going to be surrounded by poorer air quality. So it's all about linking things in. Is air pollution cause lung disease? Absolutely. It can also be an irritant. In fact, there's a case in the High Court at the moment for a young asthma girl who I think her mum's lobbying at the moment to say that the high levels of nitric around where she lived or she went to school exacerbated an asthma attack, which was fatal. She sadly died. So again, there's more and more cases we're seeing to show this is the reality. So people with pre-existing lung conditions and being irritants and exacerbating respiratory disease, but also potentially causing respiratory disease. And we know that because we know there's a percentage of lung cancers that aren't caused by smoking, whereas back in the day, we attributed lung cancer to smoking. So I think it's not the biggest threat, but it's definitely a threat.
Now, I think you mentioned something, and we'll talk a bit about few specific things like asthma and COPD. But I think one thing we did talk about a bit before we talked was, this socioeconomic factor, which in a lot of it's unfortunate realities, and that in a lot of these preventable diseases and even non-preventable diseases, you always find that there are socioeconomic and societal factors, and specifically that have bigger impact on certain groups, certain people living in certain areas. Either if you're below, or for example, if you're below a certain, I'm sure there are, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are definitely correlations between, lower incomes, well, that's definitely fine, lower incomes and, poverty and health, and, richer people, better health. And these are the unfortunate realities that, that are there and clear. And specifically for things like lung respiratory issues, are these, can you talk a bit more about how much of a role do they play, and how, we'll talk about how to solve them, but how much of an issue are these socioeconomic factors? Because as you said before, I had a talk with Anne Gates, who was exercise work, and we're talking about, sometimes people may not be able to get from in that context of what we're talking about was, someone might not be able to get to the rehab center that they need to get because of the economic factors, and because maybe they live too far away from the hospital. But in the context of, respiratory, is it similar in that respect, with the regards to socioeconomic factors affecting lung health and respiratory issues?
Okay, so if I tell you in England that those living in the poorest areas will die 9 years earlier if you're a man, and 7 years earlier if you're a woman, compared to those that live in the richest areas, okay? If I then tell you that social deprivation and lung disease are intrinsically combined, they're bound together. And the reason for that, if we think about socioeconomic status, and if we talk about healthcare inequalities, we'll have these 4 dimensions. We'll have socioeconomic status and deprivation, we'll have protected characteristics, we'll have vulnerable groups or inclusive groups, and we'll have geography, like I mentioned before. So with lung disease and social deprivation, we know that there is much more likely to be a higher correlation in smoking, in exposure to air pollution, poorer housing, poor nutrition, because it's really expensive to eat healthily, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's much, much cheaper to eat crap.
Yeah.
And poverty. So we know people who, like you said, are poorer are going to have less access to healthcare. Why? Because they feel less entitled, because they are less privileged. So it's when all of these interlink, and there is a strong correlation between that and lung disease. And what is the end result? Well, you might die potentially up to 10 years, well, 9.7 or so, the exact statistic is, if you're a man. I mean, how tragic is that?
That's a very, very big gap. I mean, 7 years and 8 years and 9 years, these are very big gaps. And, this is nothing, what we're saying is nothing, it's nothing new and earth shattering. These are things that we've already known, and these are things that have been out there. And, as you said, with respect to respiratory conditions, it relates. With respect to non-respiratory, lower back and other health care issues, these are the common themes you will find across the board from when you're talking about why people either die younger than other people. It's always these unfortunate realities. And it then becomes the question of, I know we said this again, is, whose responsibility does it then become? Because I think I'll steal your words that you just told me now, not long ago. If it's everyone's responsibility, then sometimes it becomes no one's responsibility, because everyone thinks that the other person's going to do it. I'm not going to bring up I think everyone knows the everybody, anybody, and nobody. What's it called? It's like a little, I don't know what it's called, poem, but that's who who does it fall to? Respective. What do you think, or what do you have to think about that specifically? The responsibility.
So that's a great question, and we ask ourselves that question in the dimensions of healthcare provision. So what if we keep this to respiratory disease,
definitely.
prevention, healthcare inequalities, respiratory disease, healthcare inequalities are multifactorial. Yeah, we've talked about that. It's a multi-complex model: cultural beliefs, values, behaviors, reinforcement, parents, role models, what society is telling you to do, what looks cool, celebrities are doing it. So therefore, in order to address the wide-scale healthcare inequalities that exist in relation to respiratory disease, we need a multifaceted model. At the moment, we have a medical model that you get COPD, you get an inhaler.
Yeah.
You treat the symptom, you give them an inhaler. You might refer them to smoking cessation, you might refer them to pulmonary rehab. In a really good centre, you'll get all of it. Okay, and you might even get access to a health psychologist, which can really get into the nitty-gritty about why you make these lifestyle choices. What we don't do is ever judge people. I think I mentioned that in the beginning, and that's really important as respiratory clinicians, because often patients can feel judged, and because of their either the conditions they were born into define them. So we really try and take that back a little bit and say, right, okay, we don't blame you for smoking or for being overweight or for being obese, or for, you know, for whatever lifestyle choice you've made. But what we do need is we need to address it, because it's a fact that this is something we can stop and we can control. But to do that, you need an approach that's suitable for you. It's an individualized approach. And this is when we need to move away from the medical model of seeing a doctor, having something prescribed, and then it fixing the problem. And I know MSK physios have been on this bandwagon for quite some time about, rather than having 6 sessions of touching, people are doing mobs or whatever people do, like really addressing exercise and self-management and self-awareness of their condition and their pain and how you can self-manage that. Well, we translate that in respiratory health. The problem is we don't do it on a global scale. We don't do it on a national scale. Okay. It's hard to invest in that type of model, and that's where the NHS falls down, because I think we don't look at all the contributing factors that's contributing to respiratory disease or respiratory health, and we most importantly don't look at the psychosocial or the psychological factors, and therefore without treating that part of the problem, you're never going to either fully give up or, you know. So in terms of whose responsibility is it, it's a responsibility of every single clinician. Like we said, when we just say that's a blanket, it doesn't happen. But it's about is physiotherapists, if we keep this to our profession, you know, we talk about making every contact count and optimizing our assessments. If asking someone as a physiotherapist if they're on a stroke ward, if they're in A&E, if they're on a respiratory ward, if they're in an MSK clinic, do you smoke? Yes or no? Have you ever tried to quit? Would you be interested in trying to quit? Do you need help trying to quit? In my experience, 9 out of 10 people do not want to smoke. They've just never found the right strategy to give up. So if you as the physio in your clinic or wherever you ask the patient and they say yes, a lot of people don't ask the question, because if they say, yes, I do want to give up, can you help me? People are like, oh, where do I go? There's no help. There's so much online stuff now. You can refer to smoking cessation teams, the GPs, specialist nurses. There's so much out there for people that if you engage them in a conversation in that moment in time and they really want to, make sure you try and help them.
I think well, that's one of the reasons I love doing podcasts like this. You know, it really questions how I think, and it questions, I think everyone listening, you should start to think about things like this. And you say prevention, you know, when we say this every time, you know, prevention is better than the cure. And I one of my core values is, you know, I strongly believe it when I say, you know, I don't want to be, I said this again last time, I don't want to be seeing people with chronic lower back pain. And when I say this, for example, I'll take that context, or things that you know that can be prevented just if you made every contact count, as you said, you know, because I've said this multiple times, you know, sometimes I may be, as a healthcare practitioner, you may be the only healthcare person that they see in a very long time. So how do you make sure that you make it as effective as possible, and you're not only just treating one aspect of the symptom, but you're trying to see the whole scale of it and trying to look at it as a circle, as a whole human being, and seeing what can you do to improve this person's overall health and overall life in general. And I can imagine this is something, and you know, it's criticism. Yeah, I'm gonna say that correctly. Criticism for everyone, and you know, everyone, we all can do better. And you know, if you're listening to this and you're either a physio specifically, or you're not a physio and you're just someone listening, you know, taking care of your health and, you know, looking ahead is a very important thing. And this is why I'll quickly come on to, because we have a few things to discuss, but you know, things like asthma and COPD, these are things that are, I can imagine asthma and COPD are two very common respiratory issues. Correct me if I'm wrong there. Are they the most common, or what are the most common ones?
Yeah, no, they are. That's right. And in terms of socioeconomic impact, so asthma costs us around 3 billion every year, and COPD about 2 billion. So, yeah, they're expensive diseases, but also that gives you an idea of the impact it has on people.
Okay, okay. And another thing that I've come across recently that I know it's also we also did say was COVID. COVID is COVID-19 is the thing that has changed. I would definitely say it's changed the way we all live. It's changed the way we all think about things. And the irony is, it's a respiratory issue. It's a respiratory pathology, and it's one that affects the lungs. And most of the times when you talk about COVID, people think some whether or not you believe it's true, but that's a whole other thing we could talk about for another day. It's obvious clearly it's a real thing because when you're seeing people with COVID, especially on the front lines, as I'm sure Rachel has been, you know. No, the symptoms of and the effects of COVID don't only happen to as you go into the ICU, for example, or you have these mild to moderate symptoms, or you have any symptoms at all. They can last longer than you think. And this is something, as I said, I've just come to realize how long it can actually the effects of it can still linger on, and how much can they actually impact someone's life. And I told Rachel, I'm not even I wasn't privy to this knowledge too much, so I'm hoping to learn a bit more about it now. I think it's called long COVID symptoms, I think, if I'm correct. And so basically, what is that impact on the lungs post COVID? Someone who's come out of rehab and success, they're alive now, but the journey is not over. That's what I would think.
Okay, great question. I mean, the first thing with COVID is when we talk about COVID and respiratory health it's post-viral. So we know about post-viral fatigue, we know about post-viral syndrome, and we know about the long-term effects that a severe respiratory injury, insult, infection can have. So pneumonia kills young people. So a chest infection can kill young, fit, healthy people. Viruses can. So with COVID-19, what we've seen, and we can talk about health inequalities in COVID if we want to touch on later, but what we've seen in COVID is a viral pandemic on mass scale. So some of the symptoms we're seeing longer term effects we would see in other viruses, but it's just because we've had so many patients all at the same time.
Yeah.
Now, it's really important to categorize COVID recovery. So we have the patients who have been incredibly unwell, critically unwell, who got admitted to intensive care units, who go on ventilators, who have severe lung injury, who are high chance of death. And then they survive, they leave ITU, and then they get discharged. They're post-ICU survivors, they're post-ICU patients. They have a complex, not all, but some have a complex syndrome called post-intensive care syndrome, which does include ongoing breathlessness, which we see massive nutritional loss, we see ongoing muscle mass loss, fatigue, nightmares, hallucination, cognitive. That's because of a critical care admission. We then have a middle group, patients who are admitted in the hospital but who are bridged with non-invasive ventilation. So the masks that go on your face that support your breathing. You've never been sedated, you've never needed a breathing tube. And those types of patients have a severe COVID infection, but they've never needed critical care. So they get discharged in the general community. Generally, they might get a follow-up by a respiratory consultant in the hospital, but managed in the community. Then you have this other set of patients that we're seeing who have either had very mild symptoms, in some cases completely asymptomatic. They might have been tested positive on surveillance, or they might be tested positive on antibodies for those of us in the NHS who get antibody testing, and they might be thinking, blinking Nora, I never even knew I had COVID. When did I have COVID? But I must have had it because I've got antibodies. But then 4-5 months down the line, they crash and burn, and they get what we're coining as this long COVID, which is a massive post-viral hit months down the line of having the infection, and it's really wiping people out. And I'll talk about some of the symptoms. So this is what is complex about COVID-19, that you can have someone who's in a very high risk vulnerable group who contracts COVID, has very mild symptoms and survives. You can have someone who's 50, 40 years old, who seemingly has no pre-existing healthcare conditions, who can become critically unwell or die. And there is no kind of rhyme or reason. We're seeing similarities between certain patient populations, and this is where the healthcare inequalities come in. But really, we don't know the trajectory of how this virus is going to pan out. The long-term effects of COVID-19, regardless, so if we think about the patient who's 6 months down the line, 7th month down the line, and they've either had this crash and burn or they've had this long sustained recovery, is they have ongoing breathlessness, and that can be breathlessness at rest, it can be breathlessness on very mild exertion, it can be just sudden onset breathlessness. Some of that's related to what we call breathing pattern disorder, which is where people, when they can't catch their breaths, develop an abnormal, like asymmetrical breathing pattern, which can be completely treated with physiotherapy.
Yeah.
And then we have the fatigue element that comes in. So people have unexplainable fatigue. They have cognitive impairment, brain fog. So you're watching the TV, your most favourite TV programme, whatever it is, like Towie or Made in Chelsea or whatever it is you watch, David Attenborough, and you normally think, God, I could watch a whole box series on that. These people can't even watch half an hour before needing to change their attention. And then you have the cognitive effects, the short-term memory loss, you have the fear and anxiety, you have nightmares, you have people are really struggling to return to work, and you have survivor guilt because so many people have died of COVID. If you've been the lucky one to survive, how dare you have any symptoms? You should be grateful that you're alive. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Now, long COVID has been coined by patients, and NHS England are still deciding what they think they should call it. So it might be post-COVID syndrome. Okay. Syndrome has a lot of connotations for patients when they've been diagnosed with a syndrome. A lot of patients don't like that. And what you've got to remember as well is we've had a high incidence of healthcare workers who have got what we are coining as long COVID, and they all think it should be called this long COVID. So I generally think, whoever's making the decision up there, Matt Hancock, whoever, Chris Whitty, whoever it is, you've got to listen to what the patients are saying, and if they think that they relate to that, then let's call it that.
It's easier for them. It's easier if everyone's already on the same page with what it's called. And what the things you just said now, to me, my head, I feel almost mind blown. I mean, these are things that, because now, at the height of it in March and May, it was very big, everyone was talking, everyone was worried about it. Now, people are becoming a bit more, it's not as bad as you think, and saying these type of things. And, obviously it's not going to happen to everyone, but it's unlucky if it happens to you and you don't understand what's actually happening and you're confused and you're thinking, I had it long ago, and you're still seeing things now. And the relation with the the brain concentration, that one is, for me, is a very interesting one that I didn't even think about that at all, that it would directly, and it could affect, because one thing I imagine is because we're still in it, so it's hard to see some of the things that with other pathologies, you've been able to study it for years and years and years, but with this particular ones, with COVID, it's the first time it's happening. But I do recognize that, it's the symptoms of what you show. That's what you're able to treat. Because in theory, correct me if I'm wrong again, but you treat what you see from a patient. For example, you can develop pneumonia, you would have to treat the person for pneumonia and etc. Is that correct? Am I missing the point of that, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, in terms of do you mean in terms of treating the virus, you can't really, like a pneumonia you would treat with certain...
Yeah.
So you're right, with the virus, you can't really treat a virus, you just have to treat the consequences of it. This is why the vaccine is the only way out. What's really interesting is, interesting is probably the wrong word because it was talking about such a tragic situation, is when I think back to SARS. So one of the reasons I got involved quite quickly nationally with some of the work is because I've been really fortunate when I've worked in other countries to work with other pandemic type scenarios, and again, fortunate's probably the wrong word, but I suppose I had that experience that I could translate into COVID. And if we look at what happened during SARS, so 2002, 2003, SARS epidemic, and coronavirus, so CoV-2 SARS is a type of SARS virus. It's just a mutation. We learned a lot of what we learned from SARS were then translated straight away into COVID-19. So when we talk about transmission, we talk about how this virus spread, in the fact it was aerosol particle spread.
Yeah.
If you remember at the beginning, I remember seeing stuff on the TV, you know, when the glimpses you get of people disinfecting their like groceries and things, and in our heads we're thinking, why are people doing that? The virus won't survive in those types of conditions. But at the time, people just didn't know, so they were being safe, which is the right thing. Now we know the only way to treat a virus is to stop the transmission and stop the spread. And the biggest regret, I think, from our government is not enforcing the mask use. I mean, all healthcare workers were adopting that, face coverings. You know, we weren't leaving the hospital without either scarves or whatever, and socially distancing and shielding, so I think if on hindsight, if we definitely ever have a respiratory virus pandemic again, they're the steps we implement as a public health measure straight away until we get a vaccine.
I mean, definitely. I mean, for even now, as we're talking now, I mean, when I see patients, I have to wear full mask, and I wear goggles now. And the guidelines are always slowly changing, but I can imagine they're always changing to make us safer, as safe as possible. But as you're right, maybe a bit earlier. There are loads of things, but we're not going to start going into that specifically. But one more thing that for this part of it, while we've talked a lot of different things, is homeopathic treatments and remedies, they can spread on WhatsApp like wildfire. They can spread on Facebook, and people saying, this is, you take some ginger tea, and this is the fight against COVID. And I've definitely gotten some on my phone. It's in general WhatsApp threads that just keep going around, and people believe these things. And so for me, that's one thing I want to ask you, Uzai, as you was a specialist in this. Is it bad? Are there bad homeopathic and home remedies that people are implementing today, or you've seen, or you think they're actually detrimental to your health as opposed to actually promoting it? Because in the new age of media that we live in now, you can spread the wrong thing very quickly, faster than you can probably spread the right thing. And with the amount of information you get from getting one from there and there and there, sometimes it be for people who are not in the medical field, it'll be hard for them to know, which one do I believe, and some things you might say it's common sense, but what you may see as common sense as an individual, someone else may not see that as common sense, or it may not be as obvious to them.
This is a really interesting. So it's probably like yourself, we still haven't stopped yet, so we're still on this treadmill, and we don't get to see sometimes a lot of the stuff out there, the like the quick fixes and the old wives' tales and stuff. This boils down to our very first conversation at the beginning, which is around the public health message.
Yeah.
And the real win here in terms of combating or keeping yourself safe from respiratory viruses is being fit and healthy and active and having as fewer comorbidities as that you can have. So that's not being obese, that's being physically active, and that's not smoking. So when a virus, if you contract a virus or anything else, you have a much higher chance because you're fit and healthy and able to fight that virus, that infection, whatever it is, because you have good, lifestyle behaviors, etc. So for me, in all honesty, it is really simple messages, these public messages we're conveying. Now, in our society, particularly England, but I would say with confidence, probably Scotland and Wales as well, because they have big healthcare inequalities, especially with smoking and lifestyle choices as well, is we look for the quick fix. So whether that be these slim fast shake things, whether this be weight loss capsules, whether this be machines that can help you lung function because you smoke.
Yeah.
We're always looking to combat. We're not treating the cause. We're looking for quick fixes because of it. So until we get that public health, and I think Public Health England, this is why for me during the pandemic, when they were thinking about disbanding or they've made a change in Public Health England, why now, when we're in the biggest public health pandemic we will ever see in our lifetimes, hopefully, why would you want to get away with our public health organisation? And it starts in schools. So, I remember as a kid, we had PE lessons, then we had after school activities, and we walked home. You can't walk home now because it's not safe from school. You can't play out in the evenings because it's unsafe. But my friends are teachers, and they say the amount of notes that kids come into excusing them from PE for all these different reasons and it's almost like, again, that's reinforcing it. And the amount of kids that don't take any activity up when they're 16 and leave school, like there's a massive gap there, isn't it? And it's only if girls want to stay slim or if boys want to get muscles. I'm terribly gender stereotyping there, by the way, but generally in society, that's what an attractive person looks like. Will they take on that public health message? So that's a really long answer, but in terms of as respiratory clinicians, we always bring it back to being, having a healthy weight, not necessarily BMI, not smoking, looking after your lung health, and being physically active. And that's, we'll call it activity. We don't stick too much to exercise. It's about keeping active, and that's why the Love Activity campaigns and that are really quite powerful, aren't they?